This is Dr. Michael Cameron, and this is the Registered Behavior Technician module number 13. The specific strand this comes from in terms of the Registered Behavior Technician task list is A03, and we're in that main curriculum theme area of measurement. The title of this presentation is Using Discontinuous Measures. This can be compared and contrasted to our previous module where we talked about using continuous measures. The duration of the instruction is 60 minutes. And just want to remind you at the end there'll be a competency-based quiz, and that will consist of 5 questions. I want to remind you as well that throughout the presentation you will see the bullseye, and that is your prompt to ensure that you're paying particular attention to the term or definition that's being introduced, because it will show up on the competency-based quiz, and it will certainly show up on the comprehensive exam at the end of your RBT instruction. With respect to the demonstration of skills after this module, at the conclusion of training, I encourage you to ask your BCBA supervisor to describe some of the discontinuous data collection systems they're using in their practice. It'll be good for you to get an overview from your BCBA supervisor in terms of what specific data collection methodologies they're using and those that you will likely come in contact with. But for the purpose of thoroughgoing instruction, I'm going to give you an introduction to all the discontinuous measures, just so that you're prepared to work in any situation and be able to manage with agility all forms of data collection demands that may be imposed on you. I also recommend that you rehearse the discontinuous data collection process. In one of the previous modules, I had indicated that it can be very helpful to watch a video, for example, of the individual that you'll ultimately be working with, and practice collecting data on their behavioral presentation. It could be, for example, a maladaptive behavior that has been targeted for change, and you may have a requirement to collect data on that maladaptive behavior, or it could be a skill acquisition program that the person has in place, and you may be required to collect data in terms of the evolution and emerging of various skills that the person should be demonstrating. And then finally, at the conclusion of this training, you should show and demonstrate your own ability to use all the discontinuous data collection methods that will be described in the context of this module. So the specific goals for this module is to first define what discontinuous measures are, and second, to provide a description of what's referred to as partial interval recording, and also a description of what's referred to as whole interval recording. The third goal is to review considerations when using a percentage measure, and the fourth goal is to review the concepts of time sampling and a data collection method referred to as trials to criterion. And then finally, the fifth goal is to introduce you to planned activity checks and to describe those and how those are used in the context of a data collection plan. Now, by way of a formal definition, discontinuous measures are indirect measures. They're measures that capture only a sample of behavior during an observation. So once again, I just want to emphasize that this is different from continuous data collection, where we are observing real time, we're capturing all occurrences of a behavior, we may be using a frequency count, or we may be looking at the rate of behavior, or perhaps we're looking at the duration, or the latency, or the inter-response time. All those measures we've already discussed. Those are continuous measures. Here, we're talking about an indirect measure. It's a sample. It's a slice in the life of the individual. So in terms of a robust measure, this is not as robust or rigorous as the continuous measure. However, the discontinuous measures certainly have their place in our work. The other thing I want to remind you of is the concept of behavior intervention technologies. And I've mentioned this several times throughout your training for the Registered Behavior Technician credential, that there are systems that are available that are cloud-based, internet-based. If you're fortunate enough to work with a board-certified behavior analyst that is using a system such as Central Reach, for example, then your data collection will occur in the context of an iPad or a tablet, for example. You may have an iPad or tablet-enabled system for your own data collection. Those systems are extremely convenient because you can be logging in your information and entering your information on an iPad or on your mobile phone or on a tablet. And those data immediately get transferred over to graphs, and you can see your information graphically as well. So many of you here will have the opportunity to work on a system such as Central Reach's system, and you may be using a cloud-based and internet-based system for data collection. However, there is still a place for paper and pencil and data sheets that are certainly printed out and made available to you, and that may be your experience where you're using one of those systems as well. So it'll be really important for you to gain information from your board-certified behavior analyst to find out what the expectation is in terms of data collection, whether it'll be paper and pencil, whether you'll have data sheets available to you, those that are printed out, perhaps kept in a program book, in the context in which you'll be working with the individual. Could be a school-based setting, could be a home-based setting, could be a clinic-based setting. We've discussed those various settings and those various outlets for working with people. So get some clarity from your board-certified behavior analyst supervisor to find out whether or not it's hard copy of data sheets and a paper and pencil system that you'll be using, or whether it will be a tablet-enabled or iPad-enabled system such as Central Reach's system. And if it is the latter, you will want to get a tutorial in terms of using that system, because you'll want to be well prepared in terms of collecting your data upon entering into the session where you are required to do the instruction or work actively with an individual. That is not the context for learning. It is the context for doing. So make sure you get a primer and a good tutorial in terms of the tablet-enabled or iPad-enabled system that you may be required to use. I also want to re-emphasize, and I mentioned this in the previous module as well, that you will benefit from practicing and rehearsing data collection. And one great way to do that is by watching a video of an individual that you'll be working with, or that person could be observed as a result of you using a HIPAA-compliant telecommunication system where you're webcammed into a session. You're able to observe real time what another registered behavior technician is doing, and you're able to collect your data as well on a real-time basis. The other benefit of that is that it gives you the opportunity to compare your data that you collected to those collected by the registered behavior technician. So some great benefits as a result of watching on video, whether it be real-time or whether it be a recording of a session. Also want to remind you that this concept of reactivity certainly applies here as well. More to the point, if you are doing a direct observation, meaning that you're in that classroom with the individual that you'll be working with, or you're in that person's home, or you're in the clinic and making contact with that individual, that person may react to your presence, and they may react to your data collection. So it's not uncommon in my experience for a person to be watching you, especially if you have an iPad in your hand or a tablet, for example. They may be observing that each time they do something, then you do something, kind of a cause and effect relationship that they detect and identify. Or if you're using a hard copy of a data sheet, they may notice that every time they engage in some particular behavior, you are making marks on that data sheet, on a clipboard, for example. And as a result of that, you can get some reactivity from the individual. meaning that person may behave in a way that they don't ordinarily behave. So it could go in either direction, actually. The person could escalate the behaviors. If they're maladaptive behaviors, for example, they could be accelerated. If there's skills that the person's learning, perhaps they want to impress you, they may react in that way. It may be a favorable way, but it could be a deviation from what they ordinarily do. And that can all be a byproduct of you being physically present and you actively engaged in the data collection process. So I just want to remind you of that concept of reactivity, and don't be surprised when you see it from an individual. And that concept certainly applies for the continuous data collection methods as well. It is not unique to discontinuous measures. Okay, with respect to our first system, one of the things that I want to describe is what is referred to as a partial recording method. What that means is that you will select a duration of time. Let's say it's 10 minutes. And within that period of time, you will make an observation as to whether the behavior that you're targeted to be recording has occurred or not. So it's a binary decision. It's a yes-no response. So in a partial interval recording method, you've selected the time interval and you're indicating yes, it occurred, or no, it did not occur. So let me give you one great example of that. If you and I go to a gym, for example, and we are on the Stairmaster, and you're over to my left, I'm over to your right, and I make the decision that I'm going to be collecting some data on you to make sure that you're exercising during that 10-minute interval. With a partial interval recording method, all I'll need to do is set my timer, let's say for 10 minutes, and if I see you walking and ascending the stairs on that Stairmaster at any point during that 10-minute interval, then I will record a yes, that you get credit for the exercise. So on my data sheet here, I do have it broken down into 10 seconds, but 10 minutes could certainly apply as well. So with the partial interval recording, I'll just indicate a plus to indicate yes, I observed you exercising during that 10-minute period, or I'll put a minus or a 0, for example, to indicate that there was a non-occurrence, meaning that you were not exercising. So it's binary. It's a yes-no kind of data collection system that you're using here. And one of the things that I should point out is that you have no responsibility for recording continuously. So this is not a continuous measure. It is a discontinuous measure. It's an indirect measure. And all you're asked to do is say yes and indicate a plus sign if it's a yes, or no and indicate with a minus if it's a no. You do not leave these cells blank, by the way. There always has to be a yes or no that is noted in each of the cells. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is that this partial interval recording method is pretty convenient because if you think about it, if I'm on the Stairmaster for 10 minutes and all I need to do is to glance over at you during that 10-minute interval, and if I see any of the behavior that I'm looking for, that is you ascending the stairs, then I'm going to record a plus. And as soon as I do that, I'm off the hook for the rest of that time interval, right? So I observed you climbing and ascending the stairs 1 minute into my 10-minute observation. I put my plus down on my data sheet, and I'm good, for the next 9 minutes in terms of my data collection. I don't have to do anything else until the next 10-minute interval cycles around, and I need to do a new recording at that point. For that reason, the partial interval recording method is referred to as one that overestimates a behavior. Now let's think about that for a second. Why does it overestimate behavior? Well, if I'm exercising and I'm doing that for 10 minutes and I'm looking over at you to see if you do it at any point during that 10-minute period, and I do see it, a little bit of the behavior, and I recorded plus here, you could very easily stop after I recorded my plus, get off the Stairmaster, go get a drink of water, wipe your brow with a cloth, come back, and get on the Stairmaster again, and you may not have exercised for very long at all. So for that reason, this is what's referred to as an overestimation of a behavior, because you got a plus, but I overestimated what you actually did. So that's one of the considerations when using the partial interval count. However, I will say it is very convenient to be able to partition timeout into increments, whether it be 10 seconds or 10 minutes or 30 minutes, for example, and just indicate yes or no, the behavior occurred or the behavior did not occur. If it occurred, I'm putting a plus down. If it did not occur, I'm putting a minus down. That is the partial interval method. That is a system that is often used for behaviors that do not necessarily have a clear beginning and clear end, so they're not as discrete as those kinds of behaviors you would observe and perhaps use a frequency count for. So it's a very convenient system to use. However, there are advantages, and the advantages include the convenience of the system and the ease of use of the system, but there's also disadvantages. What are the disadvantages? Well, an overestimation of a problem, perhaps, overestimation of a behavior. That's one of the considerations. And essentially, you're getting too much credit for something that you were supposed to be doing with respect to a behavior. Now, the companion method for recording is what's referred to as whole interval recording. This is also an indirect measure. So in this system, the behavior is only recorded if it occurs throughout the entire interval. Okay, so now this is different, isn't it? With partial interval, I just had to see a little bit of the behavior, and I gave you credit. But for the whole interval, I need to see the behavior during the entire time. Okay, so now our exercise challenge, I'm going to stay with that example, just got a little bit more interesting. Because now I'm on the Stairmaster over to your right, you're on the Stairmaster over to my left, and I'm recording your behavior once again. I'm going to stay with the 10 minutes in terms of my recording. So at this point, I need to look at whether or not you are engaged in that climbing behavior, the ascending of the stairs. Your legs are taking the steps as the automated mechanism is working, and you need to be doing that for the entire time I am watching you. And that is the only way that you'll get a plus or get credit for being engaged in the behavior. If you stop at any point during that process, even if it's only for 30 seconds, for example, or even 10 seconds, then I will put a minus down in terms of your behavior. So for that reason, the whole interval recording method can be an underestimation of a behavior. And here's why. If you're on the Stairmaster to my left, I'm on a Stairmaster to your right, and you happen to have stopped for just 5 seconds out of that 10-minute interval in which I'm observing you. So you were good for 9 minutes and 55 seconds, but you'd happen to stop for 5 seconds. As a result of that stopping for 5 seconds, I recorded a minus. So for that reason, it can be really an underestimation of what you're really doing, because that's a big penalty. I didn't get any credit for that entire increment, even though you happen to have exercised for 9 minutes and 55 seconds during that time. So those are our first two indirect methods, discontinuous methods. Partial interval, partitioning out the time, could be 10 seconds, could be 30 seconds, it could be 10 minutes, it could be 30 minutes. And your obligation as a registered behavior technician is to indicate yes, the behavior occurred, or no, it did not occur. A plus if it did occur, a minus if it did not occur. You never ever leave the cells blank. Your BCBA supervisor is going to use this kind of system for you. And also it's a very good system that is used many times for teachers that may have some pretty big demands placed on them in terms of the number of students they have in their classroom. So for example, if you're an individual that is working in the school system and you are in an inclusionary classroom, general education classroom, you know that it's not uncommon for that teacher to have 25 students, 30 students. Sometimes when it gets a little extensive in terms of student census, it could be up to 30 individuals. So the demands imposed on the teacher are pretty high. So the BCBA supervisor may make the decision to use a convenient data collection system such as the partial interval method. And that's because they have exercised sensitivity to that teacher's time. So the partial interval, yes or no, the behavior occurred or did not occur within a designated period of time. And your data sheet is going to look exactly like this. Now, once again, for the whole interval, the difference here is that your behavior must be demonstrated during the entire interval in which you're observing. Or if I'm observing you, your behavior has to occur in that entire interval. So you get a plus if it did, and if there's any point during that observation window, whether it be 10 seconds or 30 seconds or 10 minutes, if there's any point where you discontinue or disengage or cease the behavior that I'm tracking and observing, then I will record a minus on that recording sheet. The next system we'll discuss is what's referred to as percentage. You'll be collecting information on the percentage of some behavior. So this method is useful for determining how often a behavior occurs given the opportunity. So one of the things that I definitely want you to recall and remember is that the percentage measure is a proportion of correct to incorrect responses or proportion of observational intervals when behaviors occurred. So it's a derivative measure. So you're accustomed to looking at percentages. For example, if I give a spelling test, I give you a spelling test, and I give you 20 questions or 20 words to spell, then I'll be able to collect information in terms of out of those 20 opportunities that you had, how many of those words did you spell correctly? Did you get 10 out of 20? Did you get 18 out of 20? And then from there, I'll be able to derive the percentage of accuracy in that case. So you're accustomed to looking at percentage, but one of the things I want to remind you of is that you just can't count the number of times a behavior occurs. It has to be the number of occurrences based on the number of opportunities to respond. And from there, you calculate your percentage of accuracy or percentage of intervals, for example, in which a maladaptive behavior may have occurred. So here's one example of a data sheet where opportunities are being recorded. So just to give you an orientation here, we got the student's name on top, the school where they're attending, the grade, and your name right there as observer. So you're the registered behavior technician, and you're collecting data, and you're putting the date in the cell as well. So maybe what I'm interested in looking at is the number of times a student volunteers to answer a question in the general education setting. So during the 1 hour that I do my observation, I notice that the teacher, it's a science teacher, and that science teacher posed 10 questions during that 1 hour interval. So every student in that classroom had the opportunity to raise their hand. And maybe that's what I'm looking for, is participation taking the form of hand raising. So there's 10 opportunities, and I'm looking at the individual that I'm there to support. I'm going to call it my target student, and I'm going to record the total number of times out of 10 that my student, my guy, actually raised his hand and volunteered to answer a question. Whether or not he got called on or not is irrelevant. But what I see and what I was interested in is whether or not there's a voluntariness on their part to actually answer a question. So I see out of those 10 opportunities, the person I'm observing raises their hand 8 times, and there were a total of 10 opportunities during the course of the hour. So my guy gets an 80% score, 80% of all opportunities. He raised his hand, he volunteered to answer, may not have been called on by the teacher, but was willing and ready with alacrity to answer a question posed by the science teacher. Now, one of the things that I'll often do in my own work is that I'm always looking at an individual and how they're behaving in comparison to a same age peer. So that same age peer, for example, may be a typically developing individual. So I'm always looking to see how the person that I'm treating, who I'm providing services to, how they're doing in comparison. Because what I like to do ultimately is to get the individual to the point where they are behaving in a way that's comparable to same age peers in the context in which these individuals are functioning, whether it be a school or whether it be in the community or whether it be in the context of some activity. So perhaps here I'm looking at a comparison peer, and I noticed that typically developing individual who I was watching at the same time volunteers to answer a question only 4 times out of the total of 10. So this person gets a 40% percentage score, and compared to my guy who volunteered to answer 80%, my guy's looking pretty good. And I'm pleased with that. Maybe this is an individual with a disability. Maybe he or she is in a inclusionary classroom, and I really want that person to be integrated and to do well within the context of integration. So 80% is looking really good to me, especially as it relates to a comparison of a typically developing peer. So this is what a data sheet would look like. You're looking at the number of opportunities. That is always the requirement. How many opportunities were there for the individual to actually respond appropriately? And then of those opportunities, how many responses, correct responses, for example, did you actually get? And then that will yield an opportunity score, which we refer to as a percentage of opportunity score. And right on the right-hand side of the sheet here is a quick calculation. Not that you need that, but it's always nice to have a little job aid visible in the corner of our data collection sheets. So this is what a data collection sheet would look like, and that would concern the percentage correct. Now the next system that I want to introduce is what's referred to as momentary time sampling. Within momentary time sampling, you're recording whether a target behavior is occurring at the end of a predetermined interval. And that's reported as a percentage of intervals in which the behavior occurred. Okay, so let's stay with the exercise example that I gave. Okay, so now we're back on the Stairmaster. I'm getting a great workout today. We're back on the Stairmaster. You're on my left, I'm over to your right. And I decide to not use a partial interval count, not use the whole interval count, but to use the momentary time sample. And in this case, I've broken my data collection into 10-minute intervals. And we're in the gym, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, and you're in the Stairmaster as well as I am. And I'm recording data on you, but I'm using the momentary time sample system. So I'm watching you from 8 o'clock until 8:10. And my requirement is only to be collecting data between 8:09 and 8:10. So for the last minute of that 10-minute interval. And if I see any behavior present within that minute, I will give you a plus. If you're disengaged or not active within that 1 minute, then I'll put a minus. So the benefit of this system is that it's broken into 10-minute increments. However, I don't have to trouble myself in terms of even observing you for the first 9 minutes. All I'm going to do is observe for the very last minute. And you'll either get credit with the plus or not get credit. And if so, I'll put a minus. And then I'll go to my next interval, 8:10 to 8:19. So I'll watch you for 10 minutes again. And in the last minute, make a determination as to whether you're engaged or not engaged. So that's what's referred to as momentary time sampling. As you can see, it is different from partial interval recording, where you're looking at the occurrence of the behavior during the entire interval, and the person gets credit if behavior occurred at any point in that interval. And it's different as well from the whole interval recording, where you're looking at a person for 10 minutes again, for example, and they need to be engaged for that entire time in order to receive a plus or any credit at all for the behavior. So momentary time sampling is another discontinuous measure that you may be required to use as a registered behavior technician. So far we've got partial interval recording, we've got whole interval recording, we've got percentage recording as well, and now we have momentary time sampling as well. So once again, the data sheets that I'm showing you are great examples of the kind of data sheet that you may encounter as a registered behavior technician. However, having said that, I really encourage you to speak to your board certified behavior analyst supervisor to get a review and a preview of all the data collection methods that they're using and the data sheets that they'll be requiring you to use. And once again, I just want to remind you that it may be the case that the person is using a cloud-based, internet-based, tablet-enabled, or iPad-enabled system, and it'll be really important for you to get some familiarity with that system prior to going into a classroom or going into the community or going into somebody's home and actually using it. The next system I want to introduce is what's referred to as trials to criterion. And let me pull that up a little bit closer. So this is a measure of response opportunities needed to achieve a predetermined level of performance. And this is calculated on what's referred to as a post facto basis, meaning it's after the fact. So let's say I'm trying to teach you some important skill. Remember when you first learned how to drive, for example. Perhaps you got a mom or dad or uncle or aunt that decided that they wanted to teach you how to drive a standard or a manual transmission car. So there's a stick shift in the car, and maybe it's a 5-speed, maybe it's a 6-speed. But your requirement, of course, is the base requirement is from a stop. You're required to depress the clutch. You're required to put the car into first gear. You're required to ease off the clutch and also at the same time depress the accelerator pedal and giving it just enough gas so that you smoothly move from a stop position to a mobile position, and you are driving along, you're moving at this point. Now, you know as well as I do, for those of you that have learned to drive a manual transmission, a standard transmission, is that there may have been a number of occasions where you let out that clutch. You may have done that too fast, or you let off the clutch and didn't give it enough gas, and you stalled the car. And you may have done that over and over and over again. Hopefully it's in a location where it's safe. I remember when I was teaching my own son to drive a manual transmission, I would bring him to big empty parking lots, the Target near my house, and go into that big empty parking lot on a Sunday, late afternoon or early evening after the store is closed and there's no other automobiles around. So the point here is that if I were working with you and teaching you to drive a manual transmission, I would be able to record the number of trials that it required for you to learn how to depress the clutch, put the car into first gear, ease off of the clutch, depress the accelerator pedal, and smoothly go from a stopped position to a mobile driving position. And that would be done without stalling. So that'd be my operational definition. And then I can count the number of trials it took to get there. For some of you, it wouldn't surprise me at all if you did it the first time. You may have some really good observational learning skills. Maybe you watched your mom or dad or friend do it enough times so that when it became your turn, it was a single trial to criterion. You did it the first time. I salute you. That's fabulous. There's other people here in this room, and you know who you are. And you've had pretty horrific experiences where you may have done a dozen trials, maybe 20 trials, maybe 25 trials, maybe 30. You tried over and over and over again, and you stalled the car again and again and again. Well, for you, I could record the number of trials to criterion performance and indicate that it took 30 or 35 trials, and that's different from the person that took a single trial. So the trials to criterion measure is a very useful measure because we are able to assess and evaluate just exactly what it required for an individual to meet the criterion performance. It may be the case that I have an expectation in mind on that performance. Perhaps I went into teaching you how to drive a manual transmission and hoping that you would achieve the necessary criterion level within 8 trials. However, realistically, it may have taken 30. So that is the measure that I record, 30 trials to criterion performance. What's a criterion performance? Moving that automobile from a stop position to a driving position using the manual transmission, doing that without stalling. That's my criterion. So in many things that you teach an individual, you will be able to evaluate and assess the number of opportunities that it required in order for them to meet criterion for mastery of performance. So this is certainly the case in many of the things that that we do with an individual. Now, the final system that I want to refer to is what's referred to as a planned activity check. This is a variation of the momentary time sampling procedure, and it involves measuring behavior of individuals in an entire group. So one of the things I like about this system is that I can sit at a playground, for example, or in a social situation. It could be a birthday party, or I could sit in a classroom and I could watch the behavior of an entire group of individuals. And then in a rotating fashion, kind of a serial fashion, what I'll do is set up my system so that I'm observing each individual within that group at the end of some specified time interval. And I'm recording whether or not they're actively engaged in the target behavior. So let's say, for example, I'm interested in looking at play. So I record each of the individuals at the end of the specified period of time, whether or not they were actively playing or not. So they get a plus if they did, they get a minus if they did not, and I'm able to record the behavior of an entire group. That's what's referred to as a planned activity check, or also referred to as a play check. That may be a system that your board certified behavior analyst requires you to use as well. Now, with respect to a special note here, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that the self-monitoring and self-management component of what we do is critical, meaning that it's important for us to teach the person that's receiving services from us or receiving some kind of support from us. It's important for us to teach them how to self-monitor, how to self-manage, how to self-control. So for that reason, one of the things I want to remind you of is that we often teach, providing this capability and capacity to do this, we teach people how to record their own behavior and to monitor their own behavior. You may be accustomed to doing this personally. You may be monitoring your own behavior in some way. You may be monitoring, for example, the amount of soda that you drink, or the amount of coffee that you drink. You may even have some kind of recording system in place to self-monitor that and self-manage that. The reason I emphasize this is because if we're doing our jobs correctly, then we are making individuals that we are serving as independent as they can possibly be. And that independence is closely connected to the capacity to self-monitor and self-manage. So for that reason, I like to emphasize the need to teach those very specific skills. If we are doing our jobs correctly, we essentially go away. We essentially discontinue providing services to the individual because so long as they are dependent on us, either from an individual standpoint or so long as the family is dependent on us, then we are not going in the desired direction. The ultimate objective, the absolute ultimate objective, is to make the individual we're serving, that we are supporting, to be independent, to self-monitor, self-manage, self-control. We are also, if we're working in a school system, for example, our goal is to get that teacher to be independent, not needing us in the classroom as a registered behavior technician. If we're working for a family, the ultimate goal is to get that family to the point where they do not need us. So for that reason, we need to empower the teacher, empower the individual, empower the family, so that they can be as independent as they can possibly be. But right now, I'll put the bright light on the individual and really encourage you to think about teaching self-monitoring skills and self-management skills. I'll be elaborating more on that in another module. So that concludes the module. So as always, with respect to our questions and answers, true or false, the partial interval recording method requires you to count the frequency of a behavior. The answer is false. The partial interval recording method only requires you to indicate whether a behavior occurred or did not occur. No frequency is required here. List 3 recording methods you'll be using as a registered behavior technician. Well, I can name event recording. That's continuous measurement, right? I'll be doing timing. That would be continuous if I'm looking at duration, for example, or latency. And then I'm going to move over into the discontinuous recording camp and look at time sampling. So once again, one of the things I've emphasized that as a registered behavior technician, you'll be using a variety of recording methods. You'll be using continuous recording methods, you'll be using discontinuous recording methods, and that will be your requirement. Name a device that you'll likely use collecting discontinuous data. Well, that's pretty easy. You'll be using a stopwatch for that. So, for example, if you're doing a partial interval count, you'll be needing to record that 10-minute increment. Or if you're doing a momentary time sample, you'll need to be alerted as to when you need to do the observation to see if the behavior is occurring or not. True or false, when using a percentage measure, you only have to count the number of times the behavior occurred. No, that's false. You'll be required to measure the proportion. It's a proportional measure, and you'll be required to calculate the number of correct responses by the total number of correct and incorrect responses. And then finally, true or false, whole interval recording results in an underestimation of a behavior. That is true. It does result in an underestimation of a behavior. If we're talking about partial interval recording, then we're talking about an overestimation. But whole interval recording is an underestimation of behavior. That concludes the module. Thank you so much, and I'll see you the next time.